The very first time I played Subnautica, I did not beat the game. But the reason I didn't beat the game isn't because I didn't enjoy the gameplay. On the contrary, I love Subnautica's gameplay loop. It isn't because I didn't find the story of Subnautica engaging. It is actually the opposite. I think Subnautica is one of the most interesting story mysteries to be solved in all of gaming. It also isn't because life happened and I stopped playing for a while and forgot about the game or anything. It's the opposite again. Subnautica is one of the most immersive games out there for me. The reason why I stopped my first playthrough is something completely different. Something unusual. See, the thing is, Subnautica was so scary to play for me that I just wasn't able to continue playing. The game was so tense, I just couldn't take it anymore. And that's extremely strange because I usually really enjoy horror games. I like the horror genre normally. It is one of those few genres left that still let me feel something in my cold, dead heart. The Resident Evil series is one of my favorite series in gaming. Soma is a horror game I very much enjoyed, and the scariest sections of games are very often my favorite parts in them. I usually have absolutely no problem playing horror games. Yet there I was, sitting in bright daylight, unable to continue my playthrough of Subnautica. The game was just so tense and playing it so taxing that I couldn't take it anymore. Even stranger, the section that absolutely broke me wasn't about facing a terrible enemy, nor was it an escape sequence or a psychedelic horror bit. It was something much more trivial. It was simply exploring past this dark cliff. I just wasn't able to dive into the darkness here. I was too scared. And that kind of raises a question, doesn't it? Why? Why did I find Subnautica so terrifying that it completely overwhelmed me, even though I usually don't care much about horror in games? Why was exploring this ordinary cliff so scary, while other games that go out of their way to scare me less? What was different with Subnautica? What horror was I experiencing? This question is what this video is all about, because I believe that the horror of Subnautica is, as you extraordinary, clever viewing person probably already deduced, Lovecraftian or cosmic horror. But not only am I going to argue in this video that Subnautica is actually a Lovecraftian horror game, I'm going to argue that Subnautica's horror is the best realization of Lovecraftian horror in all of media. I am unironically arguing that Subnautica is better at creating Lovecraftian horror than Lovecraft's writings themselves. So in this video, we're going to embark on a journey. We're going to dive deep into the depths below Subnautica's ocean. We're going to discuss the horrors of the deep sea. We're going to waffle about all the mysteries of Subnautica's story. We're going to talk about what Lovecraftian horror even is in the first place, and why Subnautica is, at least in my opinion, such a prime example of it. We got an ocean to explore ahead of us, so let's pull out the scuba gear and that's not the scuba gear. Those are the trailer dissecting tools. This here is the scuba gear. Awesome. Before we start, just one more thing. This video is going to spoil the entire story of Subnautica, including the final boss fight. Don't worry, that is not the final boss fight in the background yet, that's just a blue whale. If you don't care about some spoilers but don't want the entire mystery and plot spoiled, the heavy story spoilers are contained to the last chapter of the video this time. Hooray! So let's get this thing going. My name is Ceave, you're watching Ceave Perspective, a place that hopes to give interesting perspective on great games. This is Subnautica. The game begins with the sound of an alarm. We run down a ladder in panic, hectically take a seat, type in the launch code, and only seconds later, we already leave our spaceship behind and float into space, while the ship is destroyed in a gigantic explosion. The explosion's shockwave hits us and causes damage to our life pod. The loose debris hits us on the head, we fall unconscious. An unknown amount of time later, we reawaken in the burning life pod. The life pod crashed onto the planet's surface. After extinguishing the fire, we step out of the pod and lay eyes on the surface of the planet for the very first time. We're stranded on a vast ocean, on a planet we know absolutely nothing about. In front of us is the wreckage of the spaceship that we just escaped from. A ship called the Aurora. And with this, the intro of Subnautica already comes to a close. This is all the exposition that we're given. We're completely alone, there is no human life to be seen. Our only companion is the AI voice of the LifePod's computer system.
Scans show the digestive tracts of nearby life forms contain human tissues.
Our only way to survive is to jump into the ocean and to explore. We don't learn anything about our backstory or about why we're traveling the solar system. We don't know why the Aurora crashed. We don't learn anything about the planet we crashed onto. We're just thrown into the middle of the game without much knowledge about what is going on. Our only way forward is to swim. And with this, we take our very first dive. We jump into the water and discover a rich ecosystem below the waves. There are corals scattered on the ocean floor. There are large, intimidating seal-like creatures swimming around, expelling toxic clouds if we swim too close to them. There is a cute, one-eyed fish called a peeper that emits those weird golden particles into its surroundings. There are confusing cave systems sunken below the ground, alien plants, and weird shrieking creatures that explode when we get too close to them. And with this, Subnautica's gameplay loop kicks in for the very first time as well. Subnautica's gameplay is mainly driven by 3 timers. There is our food meter that slowly runs out and forces us to eat regularly. There is our water meter that forces us to drink regularly, and of course there is our O2 meter, our oxygen that dictates how long we can stay underwater without taking a breath. In the beginning, it is the oxygen meter that dominates how we interact with the game. At the very beginning of the game, we can only hold our breath for 45 seconds. So all that we can do is dive to the ocean floor for quick sessions, quickly picking up things from the sea floor before ascending again. Luckily, the area in which we landed are very safe shallow waters, and the surrounding kelp forest doesn't feature terribly dangerous creatures either. A playthrough of Subnautica can roughly be divided into 2 different halves. In the first half of the game, we slowly conquer the normal ocean, and our main goal is to survive while learning as much about the planet as possible. In the second half, we then have set up a sustainable camp, have access to lots of tools, and a basic understanding of the environment. Our goal then shifts to trying to find a way to escape the planet and to explore even the deepest depths of the ocean. Because down there, in the depths of the ocean, terrible creatures slumber that we eventually have to face. But luckily for us, we don't know about this yet. Metroid Prime begins with Samus receiving a distress signal from a space pirate frigate called Orthion. Its pirate crew had been slaughtered by their own genetically modified subjects, which they produced there. After defeating the pirate queen and initiating the destruction of the ship, Samus suddenly encounters her old enemy, Ridley, and follows him to the nearby planet. And thus the real game begins, with Samus alone, stranded on an alien planet that Samus doesn't fully understand. Eventually she encounters the ruins of an alien civilization called the Choso, uncovers their secrets, and eventually even explores the wreckage of the Orpheon, slowly uncovering what had happened on the planet in the past. So why are we talking about the setting of Metroid Prime in a video about Subnautica, one might ask? Well, because as some of you extraordinarily clever viewers probably already noticed, it is because there is a surprising amount of similarities between the 2 games. Both games feature a stranded protagonist alone on an alien planet. Both games have the player slowly unravel the mysteries of an ancient civilization. Both games feature a silent protagonist. Both games have us explore a half-sunken wreckage of a crashed ship. Both feature upgrades that we slowly acquire, which allow us to explore more of the map. In Metroid, Samus' abilities, in Subnautica the upgrades that allow us to dive deeper, and the tech blueprints that we acquire via scanning the debris of the Aurora. There are just a surprising amount of similarities between the 2 games. I actually suspect that this isn't by accident, but that the Subnautica devs were actually inspired by Metroid Prime, because there is one more thing that both games share. You see, both games are confronted with a very similar problem. The protagonist is silent. The planet we explore is alien to us and devoid of any humans. We are alone in an environment we do not understand. This setup is the perfect setup to get immersed in, and both games are among the most immersive games out there in my opinion. But it also leads to a problem. How do we learn more about the story and the setting of the game if we don't talk and there's no one else to talk to? How to tell us more about the alien planet and how to tell us about what had happened on the planet in the past? And once again, both games found the same solution. A solution that I very much enjoy in both games. The scanning tool. In both games we have access to a scanner that allows us to scan the environment. The scanner allows us to scan relics and the flora and fauna of the planet. The scanning tool is at the center of Subnautica's progression in several ways. On the one hand, scanning debris of the crashed Aurora is what unlocks most blueprints in the game. So scanning our environment is literally how we progress in the game. But on the other hand, the scanning tool also allows us to learn more about our surroundings and the alien ecosystem, which gives us the knowledge needed to survive. You see, scanning our environment gives us the information of which fish is dangerous and which one is delicious. It teaches us where to find usable materials. It allows us to understand the behavior of the local fauna, like that stalkers pick up metal scraps to play with, which sometimes causes them to lose a very valuable tooth. The early game in Subnautica is just all about slowly understanding the rules of our environment by scanning and observing it. And this gameplay loop of slowly discovering the rules our environment operates under is something I personally very much enjoy. After a while, we got our first valuable blueprints, set up a small base and stocked up on some resources. And then Subnautica's gameplay loop changes a bit. The things that shake up the gameplay are the sea moth and the radio. So the sea moth is basically a small one-person submarine that allows us to traverse the ocean faster and that we can use to refill our oxygen. We are now no longer forced to return back to the ocean ceiling to breathe, but instead can just return to our sea moth, which makes it possible to dive much deeper. The radio, on the other hand, starts to receive mysterious messages after a while. One by one, we receive signals sent out by the other life pods that escaped the Aurora's crash. Maybe we aren't the lone survivor. After all, to figure out what had happened to the other survivors, we have to follow the signals. We have to leave our safe shallows and dive deeper into the mysterious dark ocean depths, unsure of what we'll find there. But before we explore the mysteries of Subnautica's fictional ocean, let's first quickly chat about the mysteries of our own ocean. This here is a blue hole. A blue hole is a large marine sinkhole. So during the last ice age, the sea level was about 100 meters lower than today. So lots of today's ocean was actually land. And below this land, cave systems formed, like everywhere else. But when the sea level rose again, those cave systems were flooded. Their ceiling eventually collapsed, and what is left are blue holes. Those circular, dark blue shapes on the ocean floor that mark a sudden and drastic drop in the sea level. These sudden drops in the sea level are quite spectacular. And because of this, they are very popular for scuba diving. They are, however, extremely deadly as well. The blue hole in Dahab, for example, is the most deadly diving spot in the world, with up to 300 deaths that have happened there since the 80s. Okay, so this here is the Tamja blue hole on the coast of Mexico, and the Tamja blue hole is really interesting. See, just about a month ago, it was discovered that this blue hole is the deepest blue hole in the world. Up until a few weeks ago, the 2016 discovered dragon hole in China was believed to be the deepest at a depth of roughly 300 meters. But the Tamsha hole reaches deeper. Much deeper. So the scientists sent down a so-called CTD to discover how deep the Tamsha blue hole is. They slowly descended the CTD down using a cable of an insane length of 500 meters. But they did not find the bottom. The cable was too short. The Tamsha blue hole is certainly deeper than 420 meters. How deep exactly? We do not know yet. What exactly is down there? We don't know either. Here's the thing, as it turns out, we don't know much about the ocean floor in general. To quote the NASA oceanographer Dr. Gene Feldman, we have better maps of the surface of Mars than of the ocean floor. As it turns out, it is surprisingly difficult to map the deepest depths of the ocean. The UK's National Oceanography Centre last year proudly announced that the amount of seafloor that is now mapped has risen to roughly 25%. There are mountains and valleys and plains at the bottom of the ocean, as there are above the sea level, yet we barely know where they are. And that's just the beginning, because not only do we barely know anything about the geography of our own planet, we also don't know what dwells down there. In the 1830s, the British naturalist Edward Forbes surveyed the ocean and came to the conclusion that it is impossible for life to exist below a sea level of roughly 600 meters. The living conditions just become way too hostile down there. Below 600 meters, there is no light anymore, and thus photosynthesis was impossible. Since the average depth of the ocean is roughly 3,800 meters, this meant that there couldn't exist life in most of the ocean. The only problem with his thesis? Well, in the 1860s, the first transatlantic telegraph cables were due to be repaired. So they hauled the cable upwards from a depth of over 3,000 meters, and the cables came up, thickly encrusted with clams, corals and other detritus. Turns out there is life down there after all. And things get even stranger. Up until today, the exploration of the deepest ocean depths is mainly done by single enthusiasts. In the 1930s, two people called Barton and Bieber broke several diving records in a device built by them, called the Bartisphere. A back then sophisticated device that looks like this and gives me claustrophobia just by looking at it. This device was basically sent down the ocean on a long cable, with the two of them inside, looking out through their quartz window. And during one of their dives, the two spotted something weird in the distance. In front of them was a gigantic serpent, more than 6 meters wide and very broad, they would later say. What exactly they saw, however, was never confirmed, and because of the vagueness of the report, it was mainly ignored by academia. And this isn't the only mysterious creature sighting. The deepest point of the ocean is famously the Challenger Depth in the Mariana Trench, east of the coast of the Philippines. Up until very recently, more people had walked the surface of the moon than people have dived down to the bottom of the Challenger Depth. The first person to do so were the father and son duo Picard. They had no tools to take photos with them, so we only have the written words. But the two would later report that they disturbed some bottom-dwelling flatfish when they hit the bottom of the deepest point of the ocean. We have absolutely no idea what creature they encountered down there, and it would be a long time before anyone would disturb this creature again. 52 long years would pass before someone would dive down there again. This person was a lovely chap called James Cameron, a movie director, best known for directing Terminator 2, Judgment Day featuring Arnold Schwarzenegger. The third person to dive down there did it as late of 2019. Here's another fun ocean fact. The biggest creature to have ever lived, ever, including dinosaurs and extinct mammals, is the blue whale. To quote David Attenborough, the tongue of a blue whale weighs as much as an elephant, his heart is the size of a car, and some of its blood vessels are so wide that you could swim down them. But even though blue whales are so massive, regularly growing to sizes of over 20 meters, we know surprisingly little about them. We have no idea where they breed or when they go there, and we don't really understand the songs they sing either. So why are we discussing the mysteries of the deep sea in a video about Subnautica, one might ask? Well, because I think most people aren't really aware how little we know about the ocean on our planet. The ocean depths are simply barely explored. We know so little that we even only found out a couple of weeks ago that the deepest blue hole is on the coast of Mexico. Just think about this. This blue hole is widely visible from above, and it is relatively close to a coast. Yet it was only discovered in 2021, measured in 2024, and we still don't know how deep it truly is. Obviously, no one has been down there yet, and it certainly hasn't been thoroughly researched. There is almost certainly tons of life down in the depths of the ocean that we never encountered so far. There are very likely lots of mysteries and surprises waiting for us when we finally get to explore the ocean thoroughly. The depths of the oceans are one of the very few truly unexplored and mysterious places on our planet left. To make things even more unsettling, Creatures tend to be bigger the deeper they dwell, a phenomenon known under the term of deep sea gigantism. The oceans are the home to the biggest creatures that have ever roamed the earth. They are barely mapped and incredibly difficult to explore. We also dumped an insane amount of radioactive waste into the oceans, by the way, so good for us, I guess. The oceans are a truly mysterious place, left for us to truly explore. And this mysteriousness and the fact that we don't have complete knowledge of the oceans is something that Subnautica just uses to its advantage. The fact that we know so little about the ocean depths makes the ocean paradoxically a wonderful setting for cosmic horror. It is this mysteriousness of the oceans that Subnautica wonderfully taps into. We'll come back to this idea once we start to discuss Lovecraft and his horror, but for now, let's return to our game again, and let's talk about what we find at the bottom of Subnautica's oceans, and more importantly, how we deal with it. On the 2nd of April 2016, Flera, one of the developers of Subnautica, decided to write an answer to a question that a Steam user had brought up in a forum post. Steam user Vashiri asked, "What with all the non-lethal stuff?" They were basically wondering why all the defensive tools in Subnautica were non-lethal. It is this question that Flera replied to. He wrote the following: "I haven't read all the comments here, but I'll chime in here as I'm the main reason we don't have violent weapons in the game. Subnautica was being birthed right around the time of the Sandy Hook shooting. This was a particularly nasty shooting, although many people don't realize America has mass shootings every day, every single day. Yet for reasons I cannot understand, our people and the corporation that influence our country want to continue making it easy for people to get, carry and use pistols, semi-automatic and fully automatic weapons. I've never believed that video game violence creates more real-world violence, but I couldn't just sit by and add more guns to the world either. So Subnautica is one vote towards a world with less guns. A reminder that there is another way forward, one where we use non-violent and more creative solutions to solve our problems, one where we are not at the top of the food chain." The Subnautica devs wanted to explore non-violent gameplay in their game as a reaction to a tragedy that had happened while in development. And I think that this is really interesting for several reasons. So first, at least off the top of my head, Subnautica is the only survival exploration game that doesn't feature any form of lethal violence, which in itself is really interesting. But second, and even more importantly, the fact that we never get lethal weapons to defend ourselves in a game means that we never really make it to the top of the food chain either. Most games, be it survival games or horror games, reach a point after a while where enemies and the environment stop being truly intimidating, simply because at some point we reach a power level that allows us to easily deal with all the threats. In Subnautica, however, that never really happens. We get better tools, more robust vehicles and a bunch of little tricks to deal with threats, but we never really outgrow the terrors of the deep. Instead of making our way to the top of the food chain, we instead learn to survive at the bottom of it. Because of this, all the terrible creatures at the depth of the ocean remain terrifying until the very end of the game. However, we still have no idea about all the terrible creatures that dwell in the depths of the ocean. For now, we follow the different signals to the crashed lifeboats. However, none of the radio signals leads us to any survivors. All the other crew members that survived the crash died soon after. To make matters even worse, the Aurora blows up in a gigantic explosion several days after crashing. This explosion not only contaminates the surrounding ocean with high levels of radiation, but also blasts open the back of the shipwreck. At around this time, we also scan ourselves for the very first time, and as it turns out, we seem to have caught some kind of infection. That's the bad news. But luckily for us, there is also a shimmer of hope. Another radio signal. The radio signal of the Sunbeam. You see, a trader ship actually noticed the SOS signal that the Aurora sent out shortly before crashing. This ship is the Sunbeam, and they are on their way to rescue us. They send us the coordinates of where they plan to land, and we have half an hour to make it to the spot. And there we encounter several surprises. So first, the location is an island. Second, there is a gigantic alien structure on this island. And third, the island is surrounded with incredibly dangerous, weird creatures that patrol around it. Those creatures are called warpers, and whatever they are no normal organic being. They look like a gigantic octopus with scythes for tentacles, and they are capable of warping themselves and other beings in and out of existence. If we get too close to them, they attack us. They warp other dangerous fauna into existence to attack us. They try to cut us apart with their scythes, and worst of all, they may even warp us out of our safe vehicle, something that almost gave me a heart attack the first time it happened. And that's just the surroundings of the island. Inside the alien base, another surprise awaits us. We don't know much about this alien civilization, other than that their technology was incredibly advanced. The structure is called the Quarantine Enforcement Platform, and towards the end of it, we find a strange button. When we press the button, something curious happens. Our hand suddenly becomes entrapped and a sharp, long needle emerges from the device. This needle brutally takes a blood sample from us before nothing happens. Apparently there's something in our blood that prevents the button from working. Outside of the platform, we wait the sunbeam to finally land and to release us from this nightmare. And would you believe it? As promised, a ship approaches when the timer ends. The sunbeam really came to save us. Hopeful, we look into the sky, when suddenly the alien base that we just explored awakens. The entire tower unfolds, points up into the sky, and then, without a warning, suddenly, forcefully shoots the sunbeam out of orbit. The traitor ship. Our only chance to escape. It just got eliminated by an alien technology that is beyond our comprehension. To make matters even worse, it looks like nothing is allowed to leave the planet. How shall we ever escape? Our current technology isn't good enough to dive into the deepest depths of the ocean yet, so the only place left for us to explore is the wreckage of the Aurora. And thus, we approach the wreckage. There are still explosions going on. The wreck seems still to be unstable. Everything around it is crumbling. There is no visible entrance in the safe shallows, so we have to approach the wreckage through deep waters. Suddenly the sea level drops. We carefully dive into the dark water, and then we see a shape in the distance. A shape of something gigantic. A gigantic serpent is roaming the only entrance to the Aurora. Okay, so let's recap our experience with the game so far. We are stranded on an alien planet that we do not entirely understand. We encountered some horrible creatures that are capable of warping things in and out of existence. We explored an alien base filled with technology that we do not understand. We caught an infection of some sort. We still have no idea what is going on in the deepest depths of the ocean. The ship that came to rescue us immediately was shot down by a strange alien cannon that we do not understand. All the other crew members whose life pods crashed on the planet are dead, and now we are on our way to explore the wreckage of the ship with which we crashed. But in front of it is some gigantic and dangerous predator. Our only way in is to somehow make it past this creature. At this point, we have absolutely no idea what has happened on the planet. We only know a couple of things. First, we are alone. Second, there are terrors in the deep water, one of them right in front of us, many more that we haven't encountered yet. Third, an alien race visited this planet a long time ago and had some business to do here, but we don't understand it nor why they destroyed every ship that comes close to the planet. Fourth, there are some creatures in the depths of the ocean that don't appear to be entirely natural, but that are highly aggressive. Or, in other words, there are natural and alien horrors in this ocean. We don't know what exactly, and we don't understand why, but something is going on here, and somehow we stumbled right into the middle of it. It is around this time that Subnautica is the scariest, and it is around this time that my first playthrough of Subnautica ended. There was one more message that our radio received a bit earlier, a message we haven't talked about yet. A terrifying message. This one.
9 new biological subjects designated. Mode: hunting, analyzing, sharing subject locations with other agents. New targets unaccounted for. 1.
On the 20th August of 1890, Howard Phillips Lovecraft was born into a very difficult family environment. When he was 3 years old, his father was institutionalized, probably because of madness caused by syphilis. His father would never leave the institution again. 5 years later, he died there. This left Lovecraft's very difficult mother as a single parent. Luckily, for young Lovecraft, his grandparents, especially his grandfather, were able to fill a parental role in his life. But sadly, this wouldn't last. One by one, his grandparents died. This not only left young Howard without a father figure again, but also sent the family into a financial crisis. Their wealth dissipated over time. Lovecraft later recalls this time of his life as one of his darkest, openly writing in a letter that during this time he saw no point to living anymore. In another letter, he wrote about that time that he could hardly bear to see or speak to anyone and liked to shut out the world, pulling down dark shades and using artificial light. Those were basically Lovecraft's teenage years. In 1919, his mother got institutionalized for mental health problems the same way his father was before. And just like his father, his mother would die in the mental institution as well, only 2 years later. Once again, this left Lovecraft suicidal. At this time, he had already published a decent amount of short stories. There was, however, a glimpse of hope in his life when he met his future wife, Sonia Green, at a journalist convention. After the marriage, they moved to New York together. And Lovecraft hated it there. Soon after arriving, his wife lost her business and her wealth in a bank failure, which once again left Lovecraft in a difficult economic situation. To make things even worse, his apartment was burgled, leaving him with nothing but the clothes he was wearing. Lovecraft returned to Rhode Island, and eventually he and his wife divorced. During all those difficult years, Lovecraft had been writing stories. In 1936, his first book, The Shadow of Innsmouth, was published. Yet from the 400 copies printed, only 200 sold, and the other half eventually was destroyed by the publisher. By that point, Lovecraft's literary career was already reaching its end. His declining psychological and physical state made it impossible for him to continue writing. To make matters worse, the same year, one of his closest friends committed suicide. Meanwhile, Lovecraft's own health deteriorated. Lovecraft's fear of doctors prevented him from seeking treatment for the longest time. When the cancer was finally diagnosed, it was already too late. Lovecraft died 1 year later at the age of 46. So that's Lovecraft's biography in a nutshell. I obviously skipped a lot of stuff, but I think we can all agree that Lovecraft didn't exactly spend his life spinning in the middle of the candy cotton machine. Yet, his writings ended up creating some of the most popular tropes of modern sci-fi and horror. And as tragic as Lovecraft's biography may be, it is probably because he endured all those hardships that he ended up pioneering the type of horror that is named after him. You see, when Lovecraft wrote, Gothic horror was still widely popular, and in Gothic fiction, the root of the horror is often human behavior. In Frankenstein, the monster is the result of humans trying to overcome death. The early vampire myths have vampires come into existence because of humans seeking power. Dr. Jekyll is literally Mr. Hyde, and the early haunted house stories typically have the house become haunted after something terrible took place in them. Gothic horror often is focused on humans. The horror may or may not be the result of human actions, but the horror is concerned with humans. There is something we can project meaning onto. Lovecraft's horror, however, is the opposite. In Lovecraft's writing, there is often no reason given as to why the horrors exist. In Lovecraft's writing, the horror is often a supernatural force beyond human comprehension. We often can't comprehend Lovecraft's horror, and we often can't describe meaning onto it. You know, Cthulhu or Shoggoths or Azathoth aren't the result of human actions, and they aren't concerned with worldly matters. Their existence is entirely independent of human behavior. We can't project reason and meaning onto the horrors they bring. And this is what I personally find really fascinating about Lovecraft's horror, and the reason why we just discussed his biography in detail. Lovecraftian horror often has horrible things happen to its protagonists without them doing anything wrong. His horror is about the horrors of a universe that doesn't care about human existence. Horrible things just happen because the universe doesn't care. There is no moral, there is no justice. All that there is human insignificance and forces beyond our comprehension, doing terrible things for reasons we either can't comprehend or that, if we were to understand them, would have us go insane. Which, you know, kinda reflects his biography a bit. It's a horror that doesn't rely on shock or gore, but focuses on the horror of the unknown and the incomprehensible. It is the horror of our own human life being completely insignificant in relation to the vast cosmos. It is the horror of what lies beyond human comprehension, and it is the horror of losing ourselves. But most interestingly, it is horror that often isn't a result of human behavior, but originates from a force that doesn't follow morals or reason. This here is Albert Camus, a French philosopher and author who died in 1960. Camus' approach to philosophy was quite an interesting one. You see, Camus' view of the world can sloppily be summarized as follows. There is no God, there is no afterlife, everything we do is utterly meaningless, there is no point to all our actions or values, and the only philosophical question worth discussing is why we don't kill ourselves. He was quite fun at parties. You see, according to Camus, the world and our entire existence is absurd. The absurd here means that life, the world and the universe is devoid of any inherent true meaning or sense. His writings are basically a reaction to Nietzsche's Death of God. The central question he asks is, if there is no God, if there is certain death awaiting us, if there is no inherent meaning to life, then why shouldn't we all just kill ourselves? He basically rejects the question, what is the meaning of life? As in his worldview, life and the universe are simply absurd and it is not possible to project meaning onto it. And instead he asks, if there is no meaning to life, then is life even worth living? He eventually comes to the answer that life is worth living and that we shouldn't try to project meaning onto the absurd, but instead revolt against it. So I generally don't agree with a lot of Camus' worldview, but he certainly is onto something with his observation that the whole existence appears to be absurd once we remove God from the equation. So why do I bring up this delightful dead Frenchman in a discussion about Lovecraft, in a discussion about Subnautica, one might ask? Well, the thing is the following. Camus' ideas of an absurd universe and Lovecraft's writings of cosmic horrors have a surprising amount of things in common. Camus thinks of human lives as ultimately meaningless in a cosmic sense, while Lovecraft often writes about cosmic powers to which human existence is meaningless, where Camus asks why we don't just kill ourselves as soon as we realize the absurdity of the world. Lovecraft often has protagonists ending their lives after coming in contact with cosmic knowledge, where Camus denies our values and morals any real cosmic value. Lovecraft often writes about reality eroding. You know, Lovecraft writes at a similar time as existentialist thinkers, roughly 50 years after Nietzsche, 20 years before Camus, and roughly 50 years before Sartre. He writes at a time in which the widespread belief in God and with it in morality is eroding, but before a new framework arises to make sense of our pain and our suffering. At the same time, Lovecraft himself suffers a lot of personal trauma, and his life is periodically hit with personal catastrophe following personal catastrophe. You know, I think his horror can be understood as him projecting the pain and suffering he must have felt into fiction. I think one lens to look at Lovecraftian horror is as cosmic horror being a fictional projection and exaggeration of the anxiety that is the result of a confrontation with what Camus called the absurd. The horror of the absolute meaninglessness of life, the horror of not knowing, the horror of not mattering, the horror of being part of a world we can never fully understand, the horror of being insignificant to nature, the horror of not being able to fully explain our surroundings. It's the horror of an absurd cosmos. I personally believe that the feeling that Lovecraftian horror evokes taps into the feeling of anxiety that many people experience when engaging with existentialist ideas. You know, the question is, why do we feel a sense of horror when we can't make sense of something? Why do we feel a sense of horror when we are confronted with something we don't fully understand? And the answer, at least in my humble opinion, is because it robs us of our moral shields that we use to make sense of the world. It leaves us naked. We usually have narratives in place to make sense of the world and our surroundings. But when we look at the world through a cosmic lens and at all of existence at once, we suddenly can't make sense of it anymore. Sense in the sense that we can't project meaning onto it. But if we can't project meaning onto something, then things are meaningless. They don't matter anymore. And this meaninglessness is something that we as humans generally fear. It fills us with anxiety and despair. We dread to exist in a meaningless world. And this is exactly what Lovecraft's horror taps into my humble opinion. This is the horror of Lovecraft. But Lovecraftian horror is more than just a flavor of horror. it is also an aesthetic. You see, before we return back to Subnautica's ocean and finally unravel the mysteries slumbering in its deepest depths, we first have to draw a distinction between the feeling of horror that is often attributed to Lovecraft and the aesthetics that he popularized. Bloodborne is a game that is often associated with Lovecraftian horror. In the second half of Bloodborne, we can find this building in a semi-hidden area. This building is Yarnam's orphanage, and inside this orphanage, Bloodborne comes the closest to a pure horror experience it ever does during its runtime. We enter the dark orphanage and start to explore it. The rooms turn out to be mostly empty. It is dark inside. Something terrible must have happened here. We hear strange noises. The game builds up a lot of tension. We run down this empty long corridor. At the end, we pick up an item, and then suddenly, a roar. Glass breaking and impact. A gigantic werewolf just ambushed us from behind and immediately attacks us. We fight it, we kill it, and then silence, once again. But now we know not to trust the silence. We make our way through empty rooms until we reach the foyer, and then suddenly a loud noise, a crack, the luster shakes before brutally crashing onto the floor, and suddenly 3 shadows begin to move in the darkness. All we see are their glowing eyes. Together with the luster, 3 werewolves drop down, ready to tear us apart. This here is, in my opinion, the moment in Bloodborne's base game where the game gets the closest to being a horror experience. Yet this moment here, the horror that Bloodborne creates here, this horror isn't Lovecraftian horror, is it? The werewolf jumping through the window is a classic jump scare. The 3 werewolves suddenly dropping down are a jump scare. It's the classic setup that pretty much every horror game ever used before and after. Those sections certainly are horror sections, but the horror relies on shock, not on anything associated with Lovecraftian horror. There is no element of human insignificance to it. There's no element of incomprehensible forces to it. It's just a traditional, oh shite, there is a werewolf, run scare. In the scariest moment in Bloodborne, a game that is heavily inspired by Lovecraft's writings, the fear isn't a result of Lovecraftian horror, but of a traditional shock. And I think that is really interesting, because, at least as I see it, Bloodborne isn't a cosmic horror game. At least not in one specific sense. You see, Lovecraftian horror is the horror of the insignificance of our own existence. This horror of insignificance follows when all the meaning-giving narratives are stripped away from us and we suddenly find ourselves a pawn in a universe unable to understand what is happening and why we're even existing. To me, good Lovecraftian horror is human anxiety increased to a cosmic level. Having a werewolf suddenly jump at us, however, just isn't that, is it? Bloodborne features the aesthetics of cosmic horror, but it doesn't evoke the feeling associated with it. So don't get me wrong, I love Bloodborne, as I have waffled on here before, and I do love the aesthetics of Lovecraftian horror. I love the image of occult fishing villagers being called by a voice from the deep. I love the trope of forbidden knowledge and of detectives going mad researching cults. I love tentacles that grow out of tentacles and whatnot, but those things, as awesome as they are not Lovecraftian horror. They are the aesthetic of Lovecraftian horror. Those are the ideas and images and tropes that Lovecraft came up with. He used those tropes as tools to achieve a certain feeling of horror in his writings. But on their own, those tropes and images and whatnot don't necessarily create this feeling of horror. So here's a fun paradox that I've been thinking about a lot lately. You see, I don't enjoy Lovecraft's writings that much, which is really strange because I love the tropes that are associated with him. I love mysterious deep-sea creatures, nightmares influencing reality, and diabolic stillbirths as much as the next kid. So at least in theory, I should love Lovecraft's writings. To make matters even stranger, I love Lovecraftian horror. I love this feeling of dread and insignificance that his writings aim at. I love it to think about human existence as nothing more than an annoyance to powers far beyond our comprehension. That stuff gets me out of bed in the morning. I enjoy this type of horror much more than traditional horror. Yet, for whatever reason, whenever I pick up and read one of Lovecraft's stories, I end up finding them a bit boring. So I thought a lot about why I don't enjoy his writings that much, even though this should be right around my alley. And I think it is for 2 reasons. One personal and another one with really interesting implications. So the personal thing first. Lovecraft's writing style just isn't interested in character development, but instead focuses on world building. Lovecraft's protagonists, if the story even has them, are usually blank slates that are just the eyes through which we experience his ideas of cosmological horror. You know, he doesn't tell stories where a hero has to personally grow to overcome incredible odds or anything. Instead, his writing is incredibly plot-driven. He spends a lot of time on his world and his lore, while the characters are just blank slates that move around in this world, which is something that I personally just have a hard time connecting with. So that's one thing, but again, that's just personal preference. The other thing, however, the second reason why I think I do not connect with Lovecraft stories as much as I theoretically should, does not come down to preference. You see, when Lovecraft came up with all the tropes that we associate with him today, he came up with them because he wanted to describe unspeakable horrors beyond our imagination, beyond our comprehension, and so alien and unknown to us that we have problems even to conceptualize them. Those horrors that lurk in the shadows of his stories and that we often only get a small diffuse glimpse at during the ending of his narratives are what are driving his stories and what is causing the feeling of terror. The horror and the cosmic insignificance is a result of us not having a category into which we can place those horrors. It is us not entirely understanding what he's even writing about. When reading Lovecraft for the very first time, we are as puzzled as his protagonists are about the horrors he's describing, horrors that we have never heard before, horrors we don't have a category for. He created tons of new horror tropes just so that we as readers can fully comprehend what horror he's even writing about. And Lovecraft was incredibly successful with this. He single-handedly created an entire fantasy trope with his stories. But this success came at a cost. You see, he was so successful establishing his new, never heard of horror tropes that they literally became cliché. Everyone nowadays is familiar with most of the tropes of Lovecraft's writing. Those tropes have been replicated over and over again. Cthulhu is a raid boss in World of Warcraft. There are dozens of movies and games that explore Lovecraftian tropes. Tons of shows borrowed ideas from him. Many other fantasy and science fiction authors got inspired by his works. The aesthetics or the tropes of Lovecraft's writing are just everywhere, and everyone is familiar with them nowadays. And you know, if the entire point of a horror trope is that people never heard of it before, then the trope loses a lot of its power once it becomes cliché. So here's a fun controversial statement. I don't think that it is any longer possible to create a feeling of Lovecraftian horror by using Lovecraftian aesthetics, because Lovecraftian aesthetics are cliché, and being cliché is the biggest enemy of the horror of the incomprehensible. If we want to create a true horror experience of the horror of the unknown, then we have to come up with something that people don't know already. And Cthulhu certainly not something people haven't heard of anymore, is it? That's not to say that the Lovecraftian aesthetic isn't awesome or anything. It's just to say that the popularity of the Lovecraftian aesthetic runs counter to the horror it once tried to create. Lovecraftian horror and the aesthetics of this horror are just two different things. If we really want to evoke a feeling of cosmic horror, we need different aesthetics. We need something else that we don't entirely understand, something else that lets us feel insignificant and like a pawn in a game of other players. We need to give the horror a new original spin that people haven't experienced yet. Instead of the unexplored cosmos, we may have to set it into another mysterious, largely unexplored place, like for example, the ocean, a place surprisingly unexplored by civilization. Or even better, set it in the ocean of an alien planet, have the player be alone on this planet and have them be completely isolated. Have an alien race that lived there a long time ago and conducted experiments that we do not fully understand. Have terrifying deep-sea creatures that are much more powerful than the player and give the player no weapons to defend themselves. Have the player catch a mysterious infection that they don't fully understand. We can even make use of the trope of a detective that slowly figures out a mystery much bigger than themselves, by having the player slowly figure out how all the other survivors died and by having the player slowly puzzle together what had happened on this planet before their arrival. Subnautica's entire setting is just a different take on Lovecraftian horror, in my humble opinion. It is Lovecraftian horror in a non-Lovecraftian aesthetic. Just take a look at the situation in which we parked our unlucky stranded survivor before. We just encountered alien technology which we do not understand. We just had our only means of escape shot down dead without any warning for reasons we don't understand. We just encountered terrible creatures that look as if they were designed to kill and that can warp things in and out of existence, including ourselves. We found many deep cliffs before, where the ocean floor suddenly opens up into a deep dark trench and we have absolutely no idea what slumbers in those depths and no means to explore them yet. We are completely alone on the planet and isolated. We don't fully understand the flora and fauna of the planet, nor do we know what the alien precursor race was up to. And now we are on our way to our crashed ship towards the only human-made structure left on this planet. We have no idea what we will find inside, but even worse, we don't even know if we are able to reach it, because right in front of it is a gigantic serpent. We can only see the shadow of the creature, and we have no idea if it is aggressive, if we can make it past it, and worst of all, what will happen if it sees us. You know, this situation here, the horror that we feel the first time we encounter this creature, this horror isn't a shock or gore horror. This horror is eldritch horror. It is the horror of not knowing what kind of creature is in front of us. It is the horror of being alone and isolated. It is the horror of being at the bottom of the food chain, being merely food to some creatures on this planet. It is the horror of not fully understanding what is going on this planet. It is the horror of insignificance, not being able to fully comprehend our environment. It's Lovecraftian horror, just taking place in unexplored oceans instead of the cosmos, and using different aesthetics. I believe the one thing that makes the original Subnautica such an interesting and tense game to play is that Subnautica is a masterclass in how to evoke the horror associated with the writings of Lovecraft. It is so good at it that I had to stop my first playthrough of it. The game is tense and scary in a way that other horror games never were for me. You know, for whatever reason, Subnautica is barely ever brought up when discussing Lovecraftian horror in games, yet I believe it is the best execution of it in all of gaming, by far. Hooray! So to recap, in my opium, there is a difference between the aesthetics of Lovecraftian horror and the horror of Lovecraft. Subnautica doesn't use the aesthetics, but it creates the same horror. Bloodborne, on the other hand, brilliantly uses the aesthetics of Lovecraft, but fails to create its terror. I believe that if any kind of media wants to create the horror of Lovecraft, it will have a much easier time doing so by not using the aesthetics of Lovecraft, because as cool as the aesthetics are, they're so cliché at this point that it is hard to create a feeling of the unknown with those aesthetics. The feeling of the unknown, however, is the very basis for Lovecraftian horror. It is why Lovecraft came up with those tropes in the first place. Finally, I believe Lovecraftian horror is a horror that aims at our systems of meaning and context, you know? Where traditional horror usually aims at our normal biological survival instincts, Lovecraftian horror aims at our psychological mechanisms that we use to make sense of our surroundings and give meaning to our existence. I believe one way to understand Lovecraftian horror is as the anxiety that people feel when being confronted with the absurdity of existence, translated into an elevated horror experience. Awesome. So with all of this out of the way, there is one final thing left for us to do. We still have to dive into the deepest depths of Subnautica's ocean, and we have to solve the mystery of what horrible thing had taken place on this planet in the past. Long before the events of the game, an alien race visited the planet. This race is known as the Architects, and those architects were not only highly technically evolved, they were also in big trouble. You see, during a routine network expansion, they encountered a bacterium known as the Kara bacterium on an outer planet. Not only is the Kara bacterium extremely dangerous, but their usual quarantine procedure failed. By the time the architects visit Subnautica's planet, they are probably desperate. The death toll is already in the hundreds of billions. They've quarantined their homeworlds and are now bringing the Kara bacterium to isolated research facilities on faraway planets. And the planet of Subnautica, of course, is one of those research planets. The alien race built research facilities on the planet to search for a cure, but due to the Carabacterium being so dangerous, they had to rely on incredibly strict quarantine measures. Two of those measurements we already encountered. The one are the terrible creatures that warp beings in and out of existence, the Warpers. You see, the precursor race created those creatures with only one goal in mind: to kill everything infected with the Carabacterium. The idea is that if the bacterium, for whatever reason, escapes one of the research facilities, the Warpers would quickly dispose of every infected creature, making sure a planet-wide outbreak could be avoided. But how to avoid that someone infected accidentally leaves the planet and spreads the sickness all over the galaxy? Well, to prevent this, they came up with another plan that we already encountered: the Quarantine Enforcement Platform, the gigantic cannon that shot down the ship that headed to our aid. You see, to be absolutely certain that no infected creature could ever leave the planet, they built a huge cannon that shoots down everything that enters the orbit of the planet. The only way to deactivate this cannon is by providing a blood sample first that proves that we are not infected with the Carabacteria. Our character in the game is obviously infected, which is why we were not able to deactivate the cannon when we pushed the button previously. So the precursor race studied the local flora and fauna, searching for a potential cure, and would you believe it, they stumbled over something promising. As it turns out, the Sea Emperor Leviathan species produces a rare enzyme, Enzyme 42, that can cure the disease. Deep down in the depths of the ocean, they even managed to capture a 1,600-year-old Sea Emperor in a building called the Primary Containment Facility. Sadly, this Sea Emperor is too old to produce the potent enzyme needed to create a cure. Thus, the architects focus all their efforts onto hatching its unborn eggs. But all attempts failed. In their desperation, they stole the egg of a different Leviathan creature to experiment with it. The egg of a sea dragon Leviathan. Okay, so look, sea dragon Leviathans aren't serpents you should funk with. They are ancient and legendary creatures growing to a length of over 100 meters and are extremely resistant to heat. It is said that they were capable of swallowing molten material to spit it out again at will. We actually found the skeleton of one such terrifying creature earlier in the game. Below the sea floor, there's the Lost River, a gigantic cave system below the seabed that stretches over half of Subnautica's map. The Lost River is the only area from which we can reach the deepest ocean depths. One of Subnautica's most dangerous creatures lives down there, the Ghost Leviathan, a gigantic and highly aggressive creature that is difficult to avoid. We somehow manage to explore the Lost River, however, we eventually run into the skeletal remains of a sea dragon Leviathan on the seafloor. And this dead sea dragon is special. You see, it was this sea dragon's egg that the architects stole a long time ago. They took the egg to their disease research facility, a facility where they infected local fauna with the bacterium to study how their organisms reacted. The facility is close to the sea dragon's remains, and it is in shambles. And there's a reason for both of this. It was the sea dragon who destroyed the facility. The sea dragon dragged down its egg and rammed the facility in anger. The sheer force of the impact was enough to destroy the facility for good and to mortally wound the sea dragon. But the sea dragon wasn't the only casualty of its own attack, because the destruction of the facility caused the Carabacterium to be released from the facility, causing a planet-wide outbreak. Many of the specimens were killed during the outbreak. The Sea Emperors, who weren't able to adapt to the rapidly changing food chain, vanished, and the architects, well, those vanished as well. When we finally crash onto the planet, 1,000 years have passed since the initial outbreak. Slowly we figure out what has happened and how to escape the planet. In the wreckage of the Aurora, we can find the blueprints for an escape rocket, which gives us a way to leave the planet. But to actually leave the orbit, we first have to deactivate the Quarantine Enforcement Platform. And to disable it, we first have to find a way to cure ourselves from the Carabacterium. Slowly we learn more and more about the history of the planet and its life. And while we do so, something interesting happens. The more we understand what has happened, the deeper we dive down, and the more dangerous predators we survive, the less scary the game becomes. Subnautica slowly loses its terror. You know, the first time I made my way into this cave room that has a ghost leviathan roaming it, I actually had to mute my sound because the thing was just so tense that I couldn't proceed without diffusing the tension, at least a little bit. By the end of the game, I was freely exploring below it, dodging its attacks whenever it tried to bite off a good chunk of me without thinking about it too much. The more we understand Subnautica's ocean, the less intimidating it becomes. And that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? The horror of the unknown and the dread that arises because we feel thrown into a world that we do not understand and that doesn't care for us just evaporates once we understand the world and get to know its unknown. In its final third, Subnautica no longer feels like this tense nightmare, but more like an adventure game where we finally are in control. At least to me. As we conquer the game, the cosmic horror also slowly dissolves. While exploring the Lost River biome, we eventually run into a tunnel system that leads us even deeper down. First towards a gigantic, dreamlike tree, then down some foggy falls into an abyss, and even deeper down, into volcanic caverns. Then into a gigantic room filled with almost boiling hot water and warpers. But the ocean reaches even deeper. More than 1,500 meters below the ocean ceiling, we reach the deepest point of the ocean, a single volcanic chamber, burningly hot. In one corner of this chamber is the entrance to the containment facility. The facility in which the architects researched the Sea Emperor 1,000 years ago. The facility in which they entrapped the only creature capable of synthesizing a cure. But in between us and the facility, something else. A living sea dragon. A fire-spitting abnormity of an ocean creature. A living example of the species that single-handedly destroyed the research facility and doomed the planet. Making it past this creature is the last survival challenge that the game throws at us. If we survive this encounter, we can reach the only facility on the planet in which a cure ever was synthesized. We dodge its bites, we avoid the fire it spits, and in a desperate charge, we reach the alien base. And at the end of it, we find a moon pool. This is the place in which the Sea Emperor was kept prisoner. We can't see what awaits us below the reflecting water. And thus we jump into the unknown water for one final time. And then this happens. We meet the Sea Emperor. The very Sea Emperor that the architects imprisoned a century ago is still alive. But not only is the Sea Emperor still alive, as it turns out, it is also a highly intelligent creature capable of communicating with us telepathically. It tells us that it tried to talk to the architects before, but they couldn't hear it. We learn that the Emperor actually trained the small fish that we've encountered all over the game, the peepers, to carry some of the enzymes through the venting systems and to release it in the oceans above. Those were the particle clouds that the peepers were emitting, and this is the reason why life on this planet wasn't wiped out entirely by the bacterium outbreak. The Emperor tells us about the hatching enzyme needed to hatch its eggs and how to synthesize it. And thus, we go on one final victory lap around the planet, collecting the rare plants needed to produce the enzyme. Once the eggs come into contact with it, they can finally hatch. The newborn baby Sea Emperors escape through an alien warp gate, but before they do so, they leave behind freshly synthesized enzyme 42. With this we can finally cure the disease. We found a cure to our infection. We succeeded in what the architects failed to do. The Sea Emperor, however, has spent the last of its energy. It dies here, knowing that its children have finally hatched. And with this, we have achieved everything we need to escape. We deactivate the quarantine cannon. The facility shuts down and the lights all go dark in a moment that I always very much enjoy. It feels a bit like turning off the lights before leaving a place that used to be of importance but isn't anymore. We built the rocket using the resources we foraged earlier and then we launch it, return back into orbit, we have unraveled the mysteries of those that came before us. We have studied the flora and fauna and found a way to survive. We have conquered the planet and now it's time to leave it again. Subnautica. at least to me, is the scariest video game that I've ever played. It is a game that I still have to turn off the audio every once in a while because I find it so tense to play. It is the only game that I ever played that forced me to take long breaks between play sessions because I wasn't able to handle the tension for too long. And the way it achieves this level of tension and this scariness is not by having us being chased by something evil. It is not by us encountering some unspeakable monster or by us being the target of something terrible. It achieves this level of horror by throwing us into a logical ecosystem that we just don't understand. It scares us with the unknown. It scares us by isolating us. It scares us by taking place in an environment that still isn't fully explored. The ocean. And it scares us by confronting us with events that took place on this planet a long time ago, whose consequences we encounter over and over, long before we even have a basic understanding of what's going on. In short, Subnautica manages to be scary by successfully tapping into the tropes associated with Lovecraftian horror. I find it very interesting that most of the media that I ever consumed that tried to evoke a feeling of Lovecraftian horror failed to do so in me. All those games and movies and books wonderfully captured the aesthetics of Lovecraft's writing, but they all failed to instill its horrors. Subnautica, on the other hand, isn't designed using the aesthetic of Lovecraft. I don't even know if the devs intentionally set out to create a feeling of cosmic horror. Yet ironically, I never encountered any piece of media that was better at it than Subnautica. I think if we want to get better at creating Lovecraftian horror in media, we should move away from trying to reproduce the aesthetics of Lovecraft and instead should focus on why Lovecraft created those aesthetics in the first place. Something that Subnautica truly excels at. I think everyone who ever wants to create a feeling of cosmic horror in a game, or even a book or a movie, can learn something from Subnautica. And at least in my opinion, this makes Subnautica a very special game. Hooray! So here we have it, a lengthy discussion about Subnautica, cosmic horror and Lovecraft. And I didn't once go on a lengthy tangent about how Lovecraft was ridiculously racist, which he totally was. So I'm afraid this video is already a failure by design. Sad. Anyway, before we wrap this up, a gigantic, huge, ocean floor shaking thank you to all my wonderful Patreons whose names are currently scrolling by. Videos like this one have a really hard time surviving on YouTube because of how long they take to produce. The gentle ladies, gentlemen, and gentle people in general whose names are currently scrolling by are making sure that it is possible for me to produce those videos nonetheless. A gigantic thank you for that. Second, a small thing that I wanted to mention in the video, but it didn't fit anywhere. You see, there are tons of areas in Subnautica that we don't necessarily have to visit to complete the game. The Northern Bloodkelp Trench, the Sea Trader's Path that features those insanely creepy but harmless spiderish creatures, the hidden and hard to find alien sanctuary caches, which the architects use to digitalize their personality in case of a bacteria outbreak, the unbelievably creepy floating islands, the mountain biome, and the eastern crash site. All those places are completely optional and don't feature anything necessary to beat the game. You know, a lot of the map is fleshed out, but visiting it is never needed for progression, and I think that is something that really elevates the experience. The fact that there are areas and that there is flora and fauna that just exists without fulfilling a function really helps to give us a feeling of insignificance. Even the game developers didn't put us front and center, but created parts of the planet just so that they exist. Not for us the player. It really helps flesh out the world and to make it this little bit more believable in my opinion, which really adds to the game. Cool, and with this it's time for us to warp this up. If you like this video, liking it back is what a Sea Dragon would do. If you really enjoyed it and are interested in more long form content, discussing interesting games, subscribing might be a good idea. And if you really loved the video and want to make sure that content like this can survive on the platform, then there is also the option to support the channel via Patreon. Alright, thank you so much for watching. Until next time, lots of hugs.